Lily's small feet patted along the cracked sidewalk of Maplewood, the rhythm of her steps blending with the rustling of autumn leaves. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant hum of after-school chatter as children scattered toward their homes. The sky, a pale wash of late afternoon light, cast long shadows that danced around her, but Lily's focus was elsewhere. Clutching her worn-out lunchbox, Lily's thoughts drifted between the stories she loved reading and the warm embrace of home waiting at the end of her walk. Maplewood, with its quiet streets lined by modest houses, was a place of comfort where everyone knew each other by name. Yet, today, something broke the familiar pattern. As she rounded the corner near Cedar Park, Lily's eyes caught a figure slumped against a weathered brick wall. The man was huddled in an old coat, its edges frayed, doing little to protect him from the biting chill. His face, partially obscured by a tangled mess of hair, bore the unmistakable marks of fatigue. His hands, cracked and dirty, clutched at the thin fabric of his coat as if it were the only thing anchoring him to this world. Lily hesitated, her steps faltering as she drew closer. She had seen people like him before, but never this close, never in a way that made her heart squeeze in her chest. The man looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. They were tired eyes, haunted by shadows she couldn't understand but instinctively feared. A shiver ran through her, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. She could have kept walking, like she was taught to do when she encountered strangers. But something about the way the man looked at her, vulnerable, almost pleading, made her pause. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her lunchbox as she took a deep breath, gathering courage from the warmth of the sun on her back. "Are you hungry?" Lily's voice was soft, almost drowned out by the rustling leaves, but it carried a sincerity that made the man's gaze soften. He nodded weakly, his shoulders sagging as if the effort to reply was almost too much. Without another word, Lily opened her lunchbox. The sandwich inside, neatly wrapped in wax paper, was meant to be her afternoon snack. But now it seemed insignificant compared to the gnawing hunger etched in the man's hollow cheeks. She unwrapped it carefully, the smell of peanut butter and jelly mingling with the crisp autumn air, and held it out to him. He stared at the offering, disbelief flickering in his eyes before they filled with a quiet, profound gratitude. With trembling hands, he took the sandwich, his fingers brushing against hers, rough against soft. He mumbled a hoarse, "Thank you," his voice cracking from disuse or emotion. Lily couldn't tell which. The corners of Lily's lips curled into a small, shy smile. "You're welcome," she replied, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that she had done something good, something meaningful, but sadness that it was necessary in the first place. The man took a small bite, chewing slowly as if savoring every flavor. Lily watched him, her wide eyes taking in every detail. She noticed how his hands shook slightly, how his eyes closed briefly as if the simple act of eating was a luxury he hadn't afforded in too long. For a moment, the world around them seemed to pause. The noises of Maplewood faded into the background, and all that existed was the connection forged between a young girl and a weary stranger. It wasn't much, a sandwich, a few words, but it was enough to bridge the gap between their vastly different lives. "Thank you," he said again, his voice stronger now, though still tinged with exhaustion. He looked at Lily as if she were the first person to truly see him in a long time, not just as a homeless man, but as a human being. Lily nodded, understanding more than she could express. She didn't need to say anything else. With one last glance, she turned and continued her walk home, her steps lighter now, as if she had left some of her own burdens behind. As she disappeared around the corner, the man watched her go, the warmth of her kindness lingering in the chill of the autumn air. The soft glow of the evening sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting warm, golden light across the living room of the Thompsons' modest home in Maplewood. Lily sat on the floor, legs crossed, surrounded by her schoolbooks, her focus drifting from the math problems in front of her. Tom was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, while Sarah folded laundry in the corner, her mind half on the task and half on the conversation she had with Lily earlier. "Mom," Lily said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Sarah looked up, her hands stilling on the soft fabric of a towel. "I did something today." Tom glanced over his shoulder, sensing a story coming. "What's that, Pumpkin?" he asked, his voice steady and warm. "The kind that made you feel safe no matter what." Lily fidgeted with the edge of her homework paper, her fingers tracing the lines of the ruled notebook. "There was this man," she began, her voice hesitant. "He looked really hungry, so I gave him my sandwich." Sarah's hands froze, the towel forgotten. "A man?" she echoed, her eyes narrowing slightly with concern. Lily nodded, her gaze still fixed on the paper in front of her. "He was sitting by the park and he looked so tired, Mum. I felt like I had to do something." Tom exchanged a glance with Sarah, his brow furrowing. "What did he say to you?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm, as if he were trying to coax more details out of her without alarming her. "He said thank you," Lily replied, finally lifting her eyes to meet her parents'. There was something earnest in her expression, a blend of innocence and the weight of a decision she wasn't entirely sure about. "He seemed really grateful. I think he was really hungry." Sarah's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and anxiety. It was just like Lily to do something so kind, so unreserved. But there was an unease gnawing at the back of her mind, a worry that this world might be too harsh for such simple acts of kindness. "Did he seem okay?" Sarah asked carefully, sitting down beside her daughter. "I mean, did he make you feel uncomfortable?" Lily shook her head. "No, he was just sad. And cold." Tom's grip tightened on the wooden spoon in his hand, a slight frown creasing his features. "Lily, it's wonderful that you wanted to help," he began, choosing his words with care. "But you have to be careful. Not everyone is safe to talk to, even if they seem like they need help." "I know, Dad," Lily murmured, her voice small, "but he didn't seem bad." Before Tom could respond, there was a knock at the door, firm and insistent, the kind that immediately set your nerves on edge. Sarah shot Tom a questioning look as he set the spoon down and moved toward the front door. Opening it, he was greeted by the sight of two uniformed police officers standing on the porch, their expressions neutral but serious. Tom's stomach dropped. "Good evening, officers," he said, stepping aside to let them in, though his mind was already racing. "Mr. Thompson," the first officer, a tall man with sharp features, began, "we're here to speak with your daughter, Lily." Tom's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his voice steady. "Of course. May I ask what this is about?" The officer hesitated, his gaze flicking to the second officer, a woman with a softer expression. "It's regarding a man she encountered today. We just have a few questions for her." Sarah, who had come to stand beside Tom, felt a cold chill settle over her. She motioned for Lily to join them, keeping her voice calm as she called out, "Lily, sweetheart, can you come here for a moment?" Lily appeared in the hallway, her eyes widening as she saw the officers. "What's wrong?" she asked, glancing up at her parents. The woman officer knelt down slightly to meet Lily's eye level. "Hi, Lily," she said gently. "We just want to ask you about the man you met today, the one you gave your sandwich to." Lily blinked, surprised that they knew. "Oh," she said. Did I do something wrong? No, not at all, the officer reassured her. But we need to know what he said to you and if he did anything strange. Lily thought for a moment, her brow furrowing. He just thanked me. He didn't do anything weird, I promise. The officers exchanged a glance that only deepened Tom's sense of unease. Is he in trouble? Tom asked, unable to keep the concern out of his voice. The male officer straightened, his expression guarded. We're just looking into some things, Mr. Thompson. It's routine, but we need to be thorough. Sarah squeezed Lily's shoulder gently, her heart pounding. Is Lily in any danger? She asked, her voice tight. The officers didn't answer immediately, and that silence spoke louder than any words. Finally, the woman officer stood. We don't think so, she said, though her tone was more cautious than comforting. Tom felt a knot of worry form in his chest. If there's anything we need to know, we'll let you know, the male officer cut in, his voice clipped. Thank you for your time. As they left, the unease in the house deepened, settling like a thick fog over the evening's routine. Tom closed the door behind them, turning to face Sarah and Lily. The words of caution that had been on the tip of his tongue earlier now felt heavier, more urgent. But for now, they lingered in the silence, an unspoken fear that things were far from as simple as they had seemed. The morning sun was still low, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Maplewood. The town was waking slowly, the air cool with the remnants of night, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves that had fallen onto the sidewalk. Sarah walked beside Lily, their footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness. Sarah's hand rested lightly on Lily's shoulder, a gesture that seemed casual but was rooted in an undercurrent of anxiety. She had insisted on walking Lily to school today, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a vague unease that had settled in her chest since the previous evening. She couldn't quite explain it, but the conversation with the police had left her with a lingering sense of dread. So excited for school today? Sarah asked, her voice a touch too bright as she tried to keep things normal, keep them safe. Lily looked up at her mother, her innocent eyes curious but unsuspecting. I guess we're starting a new project in science, so that'll be fun. Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That sounds interesting. What's the project about? Something with plants, I think, Lily said, skipping slightly to keep up with her mother's brisk pace. We get to grow them and see how different things make them change. That sounds like a good project, Sarah murmured, her thoughts already drifting. She glanced around as they walked, her eyes flitting to every shadow, every movement in the periphery. The streets felt too quiet, the usual morning bustle oddly subdued. When they reached the corner near Cedar Park, Sarah's heart quickened. This was where Lily had encountered Eddie the day before. The spot was just ahead, a small alcove by the brick wall where the man usually sat, his worn-out coat a stark contrast against the red bricks. But today, the space was empty. As they neared the school, the familiar sight of the building brought a small measure of relief, but it was fleeting. Sarah knelt down in front of Lily, brushing a stray lock of hair from her daughter's face. You be careful today, all right? Stay with your friends. Lily nodded, sensing her mother's seriousness. I will, Mom. Don't worry. Sarah forced a smile, kissed Lily on the forehead, and watched as she ran up the steps to join the other children. Only when Lily disappeared through the doors did Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The walk back home felt longer, the streets more silent, more threatening. Her mind replayed the morning, the empty spot by the park, the police's vague warnings. She felt eyes on her, though she knew it was only her imagination. Or was it? She couldn't shake the sensation. the prickling on the back of her neck as if someone somewhere was watching her every move. By the time she reached the house, Sarah's nerves were frayed. She quickly shut the door behind her, leaning against it as she tried to steady her breathing. The house, usually her sanctuary, felt oddly oppressive today, the walls closing in as her fear continued to grow. Sarah knew she needed to stay calm, for Lily's sake. But as she moved through the house, checking the windows, peeking out through the curtains, the feeling that something was very wrong only deepened. She couldn't explain it, couldn't justify it, but the fear had taken root and it wasn't going away. The one day, the morning light still soft and diffused as it filtered through the tree-lined streets of Maplewood. Sarah's footsteps were deliberate, echoing slightly on the pavement as she made her way back to Cedar Park. The walk was familiar, but today it felt different, weighted with an urgency she couldn't quite shake. After dropping Lily off at school, Sarah hadn't hesitated. The unease that had plagued her since the previous day had only grown, morphing into a gnawing need to understand what was happening. She wasn't one to leave things unresolved, especially when it came to her daughter's safety. As she approached the corner where Eddie usually sat, Sarah's heart rate quickened. She slowed her pace, scanning the area with cautious eyes. The spot, tucked away behind a thick cluster of bushes and a weathered brick wall, was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Sarah's breath caught as she turned the final corner. The makeshift shelter, a faded blue tent that Eddie had cobbled together from tarps and old blankets, was still there, but it looked different. It sagged slightly, the once taut fabric now slack, as if it had been left unattended for days. The sight sent a jolt of alarm through her. She stepped closer, her senses heightened. The breeze rustled the leaves overhead, but beyond that, the silence was unsettling. Sarah stood still for a moment, listening, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life. "Eddie?" She called out, her voice low, almost tentative. The name felt strange on her lips, as if she were addressing a ghost. There was no answer, just the soft rustling of leaves in response. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she scanned the surroundings. The tent was partially open, the flap hanging limply, revealing an interior that was just as empty as the space around it. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what she was seeing, or rather, what she wasn't seeing. She took a deep breath and moved closer, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, to leave the mystery alone. But Sarah wasn't one to ignore her instincts, even when they led her into uncomfortable places. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the tent's entrance, and pulled it open slightly. Inside, the tent was bare. No blankets, no personal items, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there recently. The hollow space echoed her unease, amplifying the sense that something was very wrong. Sarah stepped back, her heart pounding. She glanced around again, this time with growing suspicion. Where had Eddie gone? And why did everything feel so off? The feeling of being watched crept over her, prickling the back of her neck. It wasn't just the emptiness of the tent or the absence of Eddie that unnerved her. It was the sense that she was no longer alone. She spun around, her eyes scanning the park, the trees, the nearby benches. Everything appeared normal, yet nothing felt normal. The usual morning joggers, the dog walkers, they were all missing. The park was deserted, save for the unsettling silence that pressed in on her from all sides. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice sharper now, edged with a mix of fear and defiance. There was no reply, just the persistent rustling of the leaves, as if the trees themselves were conspiring to keep secrets from her. Sarah's pulse raced as she backed away from the tent, her mind reeling. She had come here seeking answers, but all she had found were more questions. questions that lodged themselves deep in her consciousness, refusing to be ignored. The light from Tom's computer screen flickered in the dimly lit study, casting long shadows across the walls. It was late, and the house had settled into the quiet hum of sleep. But Tom was far from restful. His thoughts were consumed by the questions that had plagued him since the police visit, and Sarah's growing unease. The empty spot where Eddie had once been gnawed at his mind, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Tom leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he stared at the screen. He had spent hours searching for any trace of Eddie, anything that might explain how a man could end up so completely adrift. The internet was vast, but so far it had yielded little more than dead ends and vague mentions. Frustration mounted as he sifted through the fragments of information, each one more incomplete than the last. Then something caught his eye. A name, buried in an old news article. Edward Collins. The name was common enough, but the details lined up. The timeline, the location, and the brief mention of a once prominent businessman in the local community. Tom's heart quickened as he clicked on the link, hoping it would lead him closer to understanding. The article was dated nearly a decade ago, and the photograph that accompanied it showed a man in his prime, clean-shaven, with sharp features and a confident smile. It was a far cry from the Eddie he had seen on the street, but the eyes were unmistakable. Tom's breath caught as he read on. The story began like so many others: success, ambition, and the American dream. Eddie, or Edward as he was known back then, had been a rising star in the business world. He had built his company from the ground up, pouring everything he had into making it thrive. And for a while, it did. Contracts flowed in, profits soared, and Edward Collins became a name to reckon with. But the article hinted at cracks in the foundation. A trusted partner, someone Eddie had known for years, had betrayed him, siphoning off funds and leaving the company on the brink of collapse. By the time Eddie realized what was happening, it was too late. The money was gone, the debts mounting. The betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow, one that left him reeling. The business he had built, the life he had known, crumbled around him. Tom leaned closer to the screen, the words blurring slightly as he tried to grasp the enormity of what had happened. Eddie hadn't just lost his business, he had lost everything. The bankruptcy was swift and brutal, stripping him of his home, his savings, and his dignity. The man who had once been on top of the world was left with nothing but the clothes on his back. The article ended abruptly, a brief mention of Eddie's disappearance from the public eye, as if the world had moved on without him. But Tom knew there was more to the story. He scrolled further, searching for any follow-up, any clue as to what had happened next. His mind drifted as he searched, picturing Eddie in those dark days after the fall. The shame, the isolation, the crushing weight of failure. But there was something else too, a resilience, a determination that refused to be snuffed out. Eddie had tried to rebuild, Tom was sure of it, but the next blow was one that no amount of willpower could withstand. Tom found it buried in a court record, a small note in a sea of legal jargon. A car accident, just months after the bankruptcy. The details were sparse, but the outcome was clear. Eddie had been severely injured, his body broken, his spirit even more so. Chronic pain, the record mentioned, a condition that would require lifelong treatment. Treatment that, without insurance or savings, Eddie could not afford. Tom sat back, the weight of the story settling over him like a shroud. He could see it now, the trajectory that had led Eddie to where he was today. A man who had once had everything, now reduced to living on the streets, his body racked with pain, his mind haunted by the ghosts of what had been. The study was silent, save for the quiet hum of the computer, but Tom felt the echoes of Eddie's past reverberate through him. It was a story of loss, of betrayal, and of a life that had unraveled in ways no one could have predicted. Tom stood by the kitchen window, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the backyard. His mind was racing, the weight of what he had uncovered about Eddie pressing heavily on him. The fragments of Eddie's past, the betrayal, the accident, swirled together, creating a picture that was both tragic and deeply unsettling. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. Tom reached for his phone, his fingers hesitating over the screen before he finally dialed the number for the Maplewood Police Department. The call connected after a couple of rings, and Tom's voice was steady as he introduced himself. "This is Tom Charles. I need to speak with someone about Eddie Edwards," he said, the formality of the situation settling over him like a heavy cloak. There was a brief pause, then a click as the line was transferred. A new voice came on, this one deeper, more authoritative. "This is Officer Stevens. What can I do for you, Mr. Charles?" He went on to explain what he had discovered, the collapse of Eddie's business, the car accident that left him with chronic pain, and his flight from the hospital when he couldn't pay the medical bills. As Tom spoke, he could hear the officer's tone shift from polite interest to serious concern. "When you came to us before," Tom continued, "we didn't know all of this, but now it's clear that Eddie's situation is more desperate than we realized. He's not just some vagrant causing trouble. He's a man who's been through hell and has no one left to turn to." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Tom waited, his grip on the phone tightening with each passing second. Finally, Officer Stevens spoke, his voice measured. "Mr. Charles, I appreciate you bringing this to our attention. When we first started looking into Eddie, we had reports of suspicious behavior. People in the area were concerned and we had to follow up." Tom could hear the weight of the officer's words, the unspoken acknowledgement that they had been looking at the situation from the wrong angle. "When we checked with the hospital," Stevens continued, "we found out that Eddie had fled after receiving treatment. He didn't have the means to pay, and that's when things started to go downhill for him. We were concerned he might be a danger to himself or others, but it seems he's just trying to survive." Tom felt a surge of relief, mixed with a deep sadness for the man they were discussing. "So, what happens now?" Tom felt a surge of relief, mixed with a deep sadness for the man they were discussing. "So, what happens now?" "If he's still in the area, we'll do our best to find him and make sure he's safe. But given what you've told me, I think it's clear he needs more than just police intervention. He needs real help." "That's why I called," Tom said, his voice firm. "I want to help him too. If you find him, let me know. We'll figure out a way to get him the support he needs." The call ended shortly after, with Stevens promising to keep Tom informed of any developments. It was time to make things right. The evening settled over Maplewood like a thick blanket, muffling the sounds of the town as night crept in. Tom stood by the window, the soft glow of the street lamp outside casting long shadows across the room. His gaze was unfocused, lost in thought, as he processed everything he had uncovered about Eddie. The man's tragic fall from grace, the relentless misfortunes that had stripped him of everything. Tom couldn't shake the image of Eddie as he had seen him that day, hunched and weary, but still clinging to some shred of dignity. Sarah was in the kitchen, her hands moving methodically as she prepared dinner. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables was a small comfort, something tangible in the midst of her swirling thoughts. She paused, the knife still in her hand, and looked up to find Tom watching her from the doorway. His expression was a mix of concern and resolve, and she knew that the time had come to address the thoughts they had both been avoiding all day. "Tom," she began, her voice quiet but steady, "we need to talk about what's been happening." Tom nodded, stepping into the kitchen and leaning against the counter. "I know. It's been weighing on me too. The more I think about it, the more I realize we can't just brush this off. Sarah put down the knife and turned to face him fully. I went back to the park today, after I dropped Lily off at school. Eddie wasn't there, and his tent was abandoned. It didn't feel right, Tom. It felt off. Tom's brow furrowed as he listened, the concern in his eyes deepening. You're sure? There was nothing there? No sign of him? Nothing, Sarah confirmed, crossing her arms as if to ward off the chill that crept up her spine at the memory. And it wasn't just that. I felt like someone was watching me. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It's not ridiculous, Tom said, his voice firm. We've been getting these signs for days now. Something isn't right. And after what I found out about Eddie's past, he trailed off, running a hand through his hair as he tried to find the right words. He's been through hell, Sarah. Lost everything, his business, his health. It's no wonder he ended up on the streets, but I can't help feeling like there's more to it. Sarah studied Tom's face, reading the worry etched in his features. What do you think we should do? Tom took a deep breath, his thoughts coming into focus. First, we need to make sure Lily is safe. I don't want her walking home alone anymore, at least not until we figure out what's going on. One of us should be with her, or we can arrange for a neighbor to keep an eye on her. Sarah nodded, the maternal instinct in her agreeing wholeheartedly. I'll talk to Mrs. Henderson next door. She's always home in the afternoons and would be happy to help. Good, Tom said, relieved to have at least one plan in place. But there was more. We also need to reach out to the police again. I know they've already been involved, but maybe there's something they're not telling us, or something we haven't considered. Sarah bit her lip, considering. And what about Eddie? We can't just leave him out there, not if he's in trouble. The sound of Lily's laughter floated down the hallway, a small reminder of the innocence they were determined to protect. Tom and Sarah exchanged a look, a shared understanding passing between them. They had faced challenges before, but this was different, more personal, more immediate. As they sat down to dinner, the unease hadn't disappeared, but there was a new sense of purpose. The fear was still there, lurking at the edges, but it was tempered by a resolve to keep their family safe and to uncover the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. The night was deepening over Maplewood, the sky a velvet canvas dotted with distant stars. The streetlights cast pools of dim light on the quiet roads, their reach just barely illuminating the corners where shadows lingered. Tom drove slowly through the neighborhood, his eyes scanning every alley, every park bench, every place where a man like Eddie might seek refuge. His mind raced with the urgency of his mission. After everything he had learned about Eddie, the man's life reduced to a series of misfortunes and betrayals, Tom felt an overwhelming need to find him, not just to assuage his own guilt, but because he knew that Eddie was running out of time. The memory of Sarah's voice, filled with concern, echoed in his ears as he continued his search. Tom turned onto the road leading to Cedar Park, the place where Eddie had last been seen. The park was almost deserted, the usual daytime activity replaced by an eerie stillness. He parked the car and stepped out, the cool night air biting at his skin. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. "Eddie!" Tom called out, his voice firm but not loud enough to disturb the peace of the night. There was no answer, just the rustling of leaves as they swirled around the empty playground. He walked deeper into the park, his footsteps careful, his senses on high alert. The shadows seemed to stretch longer here, the darkness more complete. Tom's heart pounded as he moved forward, his breath catching every time a stray sound reached his ears. And then, in a secluded corner of the park, he saw a figure huddled against the base of a tree, almost swallowed by the darkness. Tom's heart leapt into his throat. It was Eddie. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle the man. "Eddie," he called again, softer this time, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. Eddie looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion and weariness. For a moment, he seemed ready to bolt, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "Tom!" Eddie's voice was a mere whisper, a ghost of the man he had once been. He didn't move from his spot, his body curled in on itself as if bracing against an unseen threat. Tom crouched down beside him, keeping his tone calm and reassuring. "Eddie, I've been looking for you. We need to get you out of here. Let me help you." Eddie shook his head weakly, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I'm fine here. Don't worry about me." "You're not fine, Eddie," Tom said, a note of urgency creeping into his voice. "You can't stay here like this. Please, let me take you to the hospital." For a long moment, Eddie didn't respond. His breathing labored, his eyes unfocused. Tom could see the battle waging within him, the fear of trusting someone again, the overwhelming fatigue, the hopelessness that had taken root deep in his soul. Then, just as Tom was about to speak again, Eddie's body seemed to give in all at once. His eyes fluttered shut, and he slumped forward, his breathing growing shallow and irregular. Panic surged through Tom as he caught Eddie before he could fall completely. "Eddie! Eddie! Stay with me!" Tom's voice shook as he quickly assessed the situation. Eddie's pulse was faint, his skin cold to the touch. There was no time to hesitate. Tom acted on instinct, his years of training in emergencies kicking in. He scooped Eddie up, the man's frail body alarmingly light in his arms, and hurried back to the car. The park seemed to close in around him, the darkness pressing in, but Tom forced himself to stay focused. He laid Eddie in the back seat as gently as he could, then rushed to the driver's seat, the urgency of the situation driving his every move. The engine roared to life, and Tom sped through the empty streets, the hospital, his only destination. "Hang on, Eddie," Tom muttered under his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Just hang on." The minutes stretched endlessly, each one a lifetime as Tom raced against time. He could hear Eddie's faint breaths, each one a painful reminder of how fragile the man's life had become. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway flickered overhead as Tom walked his steps slow. Eddie lay on the narrow bed, his eyes half closed, the exhaustion etched deep into the lines of his face. The paramedics had been gentle, respectful, but there was a distance in their demeanor, a professional detachment that contrasted sharply with Tom's growing concern. "Is he going to be okay?" Tom asked, his voice quiet, but firm enough to convey the weight of his question. One of the paramedics, a young woman with a reassuring smile, nodded. "He's stable, but he'll need proper medical care. The doctors will do a full assessment once we get him settled." Tom nodded, though the answer did little to ease the tightness in his chest. He had done what he could, found Eddie, brought him here, but the feeling of helplessness lingered. He watched as the paramedics wheeled Eddie into a room, the door swinging shut behind them, leaving Tom alone in the sterile hallway. He stood there for a moment, the silence pressing in on him, before he reached for his phone. The urge to call Sarah was strong. She needed to know what was happening, needed to be here. But Tom hesitated. There was no sense in worrying her until they knew more. Instead, he sent a brief text, just enough to let her know they were at the hospital. Minutes later, Tom was guided to a small waiting room, the kind designed to be comforting, but that always felt clinical. The walls were painted in soft pastels, the chairs cushioned but stiff, and a stack of outdated magazines lay untouched on a coffee table. Tom didn't sit. He paced, his mind spinning with thoughts of what came next. A nurse appeared after what felt like hours, but was likely only a fraction of that time. "Mr. Charles?" Tom looked up, his heart racing. "Yes, that's me." "The doctor is with Mr. Edwards now," she said, using the name Eddie had given them. "It looks like he's severely malnourished and dehydrated, but with some time and care he should recover. There are some older injuries that seem to have healed improperly, but we'll need to do more tests to see what else might be going on." "Can I see him?" Tom asked, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. The nurse hesitated, then nodded. "He's resting now, but you can sit with him. Just keep it quiet." Tom followed her through the labyrinth of hallways until they reached Eddie's room. The door was slightly ajar, and Tom slipped inside, his footsteps soft on the linoleum floor. Eddie lay still on the bed, an IV drip attached to his arm, monitors beeping quietly in the background. He looked smaller than Tom remembered, the hospital gown hanging loosely on his thin frame. But there was a peace in his expression that hadn't been there before, a surrender to the care he was finally receiving. Tom pulled up a chair beside the bed, sitting down with a quiet sigh. He watched Eddie's chest rise and fall with each breath, the steady rhythm somehow calming. For the first time in what felt like days, Tom allowed himself to relax, the tension easing out of his shoulders as he settled into the chair. He sat there for a long time, just watching, lost in his thoughts. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the machines, and the peace of it all began to seep into Tom's bones. This was the right thing to do, bringing Eddie here, giving him a chance. Tom didn't know what would come next, but for now, this was enough. A soft knock at the door pulled Tom from his reverie. He looked up to see Sarah standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of worry and relief. She had come as soon as she got his message, and the sight of her brought a warmth to Tom's chest that he hadn't realized he needed. "Hey," she whispered, stepping into the room. "How is he?" Tom stood, crossing the room to meet her. "The doctors think he'll be okay, but it's going to take time." Sarah nodded, her eyes drifting to Eddie's sleeping form. "You did the right thing, Tom. He wouldn't have made it much longer out there." "I know," Tom said, his voice heavy with the weight of that knowledge. "But we've got a long road ahead." Sarah slipped her hand into his, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We'll get through it. Together." They stood there in silence, the room filled with a quiet hope that hadn't been there before. Tom could feel it in the way Eddie's breathing had steadied, in the warmth of Sarah's hand in his, in the knowledge that they were all finally moving toward something better. As they left the hospital room that night, Tom and Sarah both knew they were taking Eddie home to more than just a house. They were bringing him into their lives, into a future that, despite its uncertainty, was bright with the possibility of healing and hope. Eddie sat on the edge of his new bed, the mattress firm yet unfamiliar beneath him. The small apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the adjoining kitchenette. The room was sparsely furnished, just the essentials: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a dresser. But it was clean, warm, and most importantly, it was his. He glanced around, the reality of it all still sinking in. After so many years of drifting, he finally had a place to call his own. The process had been overwhelming, the paperwork and the bureaucracy a maze he couldn't have navigated alone. But Tom and Sarah had been there every step of the way, guiding him through it with a patience that he hadn't expected. He had been skeptical at first when they told him about the city's new healthcare program, a lifeline for people like him. Free medical care, housing assistance. It had sounded too good to be true. But now, sitting in this apartment, Eddie realized it was real. The city had come through for him, and so had the Charles family. A soft knock on the door pulled Eddie from his thoughts. He stood, hesitating for a moment before crossing the room to open it. Tom and Sarah stood on the other side, smiling in that way that had become so familiar over the past few weeks. "Hey, Eddie," Tom said, his voice warm. "We thought we'd drop by and see how you're settling in." Eddie stepped aside to let them in, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's different," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of all that had come before. "But it's good. Real good." Sarah looked around the apartment, her eyes lingering on the small details. "It's a start," she said softly. "And from what I've seen, you're going to make it a real home." Eddie nodded, his gaze following hers. "I hope so. It's been a long time since I had a place like this." Tom clapped a hand on Eddie's shoulder, the gesture both comforting and reassuring. "You've come a long way, Eddie, and you've got a lot to look forward to." Eddie glanced at Tom, the sincerity in his words something Eddie had come to trust. "I never thought I'd get here," Eddie said, his voice low. "Not after everything." Sarah stepped closer, her expression gentle. "You're not alone in this. We're here, and we're going to help you every step of the way." Eddie felt a lump form in his throat, the emotions he had kept buried for so long threatening to surface. He had spent years building walls around himself, walls that kept out the pain, but also the possibility of hope. But Tom and Sarah had chipped away at those walls brick by brick until he could finally see the light beyond them. The sound of laughter drifted up from the street below, children playing in the last golden rays of the afternoon sun. Eddie moved to the window, looking down at the scene. It was simple, ordinary, but it filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "Lily's got a school event this weekend," Tom said, breaking the silence. "She'd love for you to come. It's a little science fair, nothing too fancy, but she's pretty excited about it." Eddie turned from the window, his eyes meeting Tom's. "I'd like that," he said, the words carrying more meaning than he could express. It wasn't just the invitation, it was what it represented. A place in their lives, a role in their family. Sarah smiled, her eyes warm. Then it settled. "We'll pick you up Saturday morning." Eddie nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the sun. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something, like he belonged. The weekend came quickly, and before he knew it, Eddie found himself standing in the bustling hallway of Lily's school, surrounded by excited children and proud parents. The noise was overwhelming at first, a chaotic mix of laughter, chatter, and the occasional burst of applause. But as soon as he saw Lily, all the tension melted away. She spotted him from across the room, her face lighting up with a grin that was all innocence and joy. She ran over, her science project forgotten, for a moment, as she hugged him around the waist. "You came!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with pure delight. Eddie chuckled, the sound foreign to his own ears. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The science fair was a small affair, but to Eddie it felt monumental. He watched as Lily proudly explained her project to the judges, her enthusiasm infectious. Tom and Sarah stood beside him, their presence a steady anchor in this new, uncharted territory. After the fair, they all went to the park. Cedar Park, the very place where Eddie's journey had taken a fateful turn. But now the park held no shadows, no fear. It was filled with light, with life, with hope. They sat on a bench watching as Lily played with some friends nearby. The late afternoon sun bathed the park in a golden glow, and for the first time in years, Eddie felt a sense of contentment, of peace. "Thank you," Eddie said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. He looked at Tom and Sarah, his eyes full of gratitude. "For everything." Tom smiled, his gaze steady. "You don't have to thank us, Eddie. We're family now." Eddie looked away, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. He had come so far, from the streets to this moment, surrounded by people who cared for him, who had given him a second chance. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that he deserved it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Eddie knew that this was only the beginning, a new chapter in a life that had once seemed destined for darkness. But now, with the Charles family by his side, the future looked brighter than he had ever imagined. And as they all walked back to the car, Lily skipping ahead, Tom and Sarah beside him, Eddie felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging, of home. Wow, what an intense chapter. You can really feel the tension building in Tom and Sarah as they start to realize that something much bigger might be at play here. Lily's act of kindness is just the beginning, and I'm sure you're all just as eager as I am to see how this unfolds. If you enjoyed this chapter, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on what's coming next. And hey, share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think the police know about Eddie? Do you think Lily's family is in danger, or is there something else going on? As always, thank you so much for watching and being part of this incredible community. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to dive deeper into this story with you all. Stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next episode.